I'm trained as a computer scientist, but was honored to be a part of the library and archive profession for many years. And historian and archivists need to know the daily details of life in order to write about the past. And I became aware that much of what was happening in 2021 was all through technology. And I began to wonder, could we keep track of, how would we keep track of the COVID-19 pandemic in the future? And that was the inspiration for this event. So what do I mean by hyperlocal? I am talking about, we talk about local governments being the mayor, the city council, maybe your borough president or the community board. Still, you might not have ever met those people. Hyperlocal are the faces you know. They're the people you say hi to. They're the people that you collaborate with at a regular basis to work together, sometimes almost hand to hand. And that's what we're going to think about together today. So I wanted us to think through, as we're moving forward into what we're saving and what we're not saving, is to really focus on the hyperlocal and think about what we're saving and keeping is an ethical issue. So that way we know everyone's experiences in the future. And this gets me into talking about a really, really interesting piece that this art piece was actually exhibited in New York City right around Christmas, I think it was 2017. And Mimi Onuoha, who is a professor at NYU, exhibited this piece. And it was called The Library of Missing Datasets, where she started to articulate, what is it that we don't know? Very often when we talk about big data, particularly open data, we can go to town about everything we've saved and all the information that we have, but we don't have a lot of other things. You can see some of the things listed here. Locations of illegal apartments in Washington, D.C., all extinct languages, number of nuclear weapons. So we start to think through what's missing. And what I'm hoping that we can do today is find out some of the hyperlocal data sets that might be missing that are out there. Yeah. So I just wanted to give you a view of what this actually looked like. So she created actual file case that listed with empty file folders of what's not there. And what I'm hoping we can do today and together through the workshop aspect is start to fill in those pieces of what was there. In the introduction for this piece, I had asked people to think through what they were doing. So hyperlocal means what was going on in your apartment complex, in your neighborhood, centered around a local store, maybe your building, maybe even just a floor in your apartment complex. What were the spreadsheets? What were the shared documents that you created? And 2020 had lots of major events where we came together to find out new types of data. One was the civil unrest and social unrest and the protests after the death of George Floyd. And we also had things that were happening during the pandemic. So in both cases, digital material arose in order to understand how we were coming together. At this point, I'm going to introduce one of the postdocs for the Alliance for Public Interest Technology at NYU, Dr. Matt Bowie, who is going to give us a little bit of start of understanding this field of data justice and data empowerment and how he saw this play out in LA.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Matt Bowie. I'm a current postdoc at the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Tech. And as we just dive in and continue this discussion about open data, Open Data Week, how do we as open data professionals think about data justice? I'm going to provide a few short provocations to think through. So, and a brief primer is that I came to this work as a nonprofit marketing strategist, and I went back to grad school because I think a lot of the struggles that I was engaging with was that there was missing data, or the data weren't always speaking to the causes of the constituents. So underlying a lot of this data justice work, the study that I'm previewing, that I'm going over in brief, it's these questions of how does data serve marginalized communities? Who does data serve? How do we tell stories about data as well as with data and think about those complicated ethical problems and ethical issues, especially pushing the needle towards justice and a redistribution of resources? So to begin, I'm thinking about just redlining. In the course of my work, I've been thinking about redlining as a data-driven technology. So as you think about the FHA and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, how different data schemas rendered communities of color, Black, brown, as well as immigrant communities as red or yellow in this map of Los Angeles. Whereas those on the periphery, the more affluent, the middle and upper class white communities were rendered as more worthy of investment, more worthy of mortgage approvals, or blue and green, based on different categorizations and different calculations. So underlying a lot of this work that I'm doing is thinking about the racial politics of data. How is data used to render specific communities as invisible within resource allocation decisions, whereas they're hyper visible within criminal justice decisions or the criminal justice databases, right? So thinking through that and thinking, how do we really think about how we tell stories about data? I actually go up against the data is neutral myth often, but also how do we use data in novel strategies and ways to advocate for justice and advocate for such communities. And the study that I'm going to delve into data justice with you all is just thinking really about Los Angeles, but I think we can apply it to New York. There's a lot of great data justice work in New York and nationally and globally. But thinking about and thinking through what are the different ways that community-based organizations are engaging with data, but also disengaging from data. And how does this hyper-local view inform our work as we think about how to partner with, work alongside, learn from these types of organizations. So this study, it's as some background, it was a 3-year field work in Los Angeles, working and observing and just being in touch with a lot of these grassroots organizations. But come COVID time, instead of being able to meet with them, a lot of my research went online. So the study I'm going to be presenting is a content analysis of 70 posts from 11 different organizations in Los Angeles. And I can give you more details about that later if you're curious, but just going to briefly go through some of the findings. To begin, the findings kind of touched on 4 categories of different engagements and disengagements with data. This first category, data use, is thinking about how different organizations, to fill in missing gaps, they did primary data collection, right? So they had to do interviews, oral histories, surveys to collect missing data to address data gaps. Whereas the second bucket of strategies was data reuse. So looking at the census data, looking at other available data sources to repurpose. So in this strategy, I'm also thinking about work in New York and LA, such as the anti-eviction mapping project, where they cull LLC data to think about unlawful evictions and how the financialization of real estate is impacting marginalized tenants and unlawful evictions. The third bucket is thinking about data refusal, thinking about more of an active orientation to the collection or application of data. So whereas data use and reuse is really using and reusing and like, oh, data's okay, data refusal actually calls attention to questions of what is data not useful for? What should data not be used for? So in this work, thinking about Mi Gente's No Tech for ICE campaign, thinking about other ways to gather public awareness about the political and weaponization of data against communities of color. And then finally, this fourth bucket is just data production. I think open data professionals, academics alike, there's always this production, right? You share the reports, you share the data sets. There's this ethos of wanting to address data gaps by sharing. So how are there novel production strategies such as zines or infographics to have more public awareness about issues, to engage with a broader public and not just those that are necessarily data literate. And so the next few slides are just a few quotes to kind of extrapolate and kind of deepen these buckets. But this first quote is coming from Data for Black Lives. Yeshi Milner, the co-founder of Data for Black Lives, shares that for those of us living on the margins, data is protests, collecting and analyzing data is accountability, and data is collective action. So in this, she's just really calling attention to the ways that we can use data and reuse data to address knowledge gaps. And in the specific moment, Yeshi Milner was calling attention to how COVID-19 data was lacking racial data and not, so therefore there were knowledge gaps about the ways in which a year later, we're talking still, but how COVID-19 disparately impacted communities, especially those that were most harmed and most at risk. Meanwhile, in this quote, in another piece by Yeshi Milner as well, from Data for Black Lives, she's talking about data refusal for public education and awareness. In that red box, you'll see kind of the ways in which they're using this graphic to think about how data has inputs, but these data outputs are what specifically has happened has been weaponized against specifically the Black community. And so as we think about data refusal, thinking about the ways in which risk ratios, credit scores, car insurance payments are all tied to a zip code, and how that data inputted is reflective of longstanding structural inequalities, and how we need to question, think through, be transparent about these data-driven decisions that are increasingly getting pushed. And then finally, I include this quote to think about data refusal and production from this group called Our Data Bodies, who's one of the leaders in data justice work. In their digital defense playbook, they share that they're not only are they producing data to call attention to issues of their impacted communities, but they also want to shine a light on how communities have been confronting data-driven problems and forge an analysis from and within these allied struggles. More than happy to go deeper, but I think the takeaway from this is just thinking about and pushing us to all think about, as open data professionals, what tactics and tools do we have to usher in social justice through the use, reuse, refusal of data? What tools do we need? And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. Thank you.
That was amazing, Matt. Thank you. That was a very succinct presentation of a lot of really interesting and deep knowledge, I know. I think we're going to move forward to Jonathan Chin, who is a former student of mine in my Ethics of Data Science class. And he is also, I believe, a graduate of the NYU, or the class was a part of the NYU Data Science for Social Impact degree. Jonathan currently serves as the Interim Chief Technology Officer at the New York City Food Policy Center.
So thank you all for joining us today. I want to talk about this mammoth undertaking that myself and the New York City Food Policy Center have taken on since the start of the pandemic. We call it the New York City Neighborhood Food Resource Guides. In a nutshell, it is a comprehensive list of food resources that is updated nightly. The purpose of it is we designed something to make sure that New York City remained food secure during the pandemic. And so the major way that we do that is we have the most comprehensive database of food pantries and soup kitchens, in addition to the kind of info that you would normally expect, like addresses and hours of operation. We went out of our way to gather crucial information like dietary accommodations, any access requirements like proof of residency, and any unique operational notes. We also have a fairly lengthy list of supermarkets and grocery stores with particular attention to their delivery options and the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables. Early on in the pandemic, when everybody was at home and sort of rushing to their local grocery stores, this kind of information was incredibly important. And then we also have additional relevant resources. Our main target was food pantries, soup kitchens, and grocery stores, but we also tried to provide access to things like homelessness services, WIC and SNAP sign-up assistance, because we recognize that these were also valuable tools for the people that we were serving. To step back a little bit and understand or remember the landscape of New York City and how that drove the need for this project, I just want to go over some statistics about what has happened. So our already critical food system was suddenly ruptured with the closure of everything. To give you some sense, since March 2020, the number of residents receiving food assistance has doubled to 2 million New Yorkers. And this is only the official food assistance programs that we know about. There's a lot of informal and unofficial food assistance that is going on. Coupled with that, 1/3 of the food pantries and soup kitchens closed due to lack of resources, lack of volunteers, a whole number of other issues. Unemployment skyrocketed from 3.4% to 16%. So suddenly a lot of New Yorkers who have never had to ask for food assistance were now trying to navigate that system. Additionally, mandated social distancing reduced food pantry volunteers and upturned our standard service protocols. Prior to the pandemic, there was a huge move to allow people to enter food pantries and select the items that they wanted and to have more of a shopping experience. But with the public health protocols, we couldn't do that. And a lot of food pantries had to revert to sort of pre-packaged boxes. So all of their logistics had just like turned on the dime. And I don't know if any of you remember or have experienced the grab and go meal program that was rolled out to initially support school children. That initial rollout was incredibly chaotic. sites that were listed as giving out meals ended up not being able to give out meals, and the rules and regulations about who could receive it were unclear, things like that. Some of the major challenges that had arisen in the first couple of months was that the data about food assistance in these resources was incredibly fragmented. And when we stepped in to start analyzing this, we also found that a lot of it was out of date, which was a huge concern because we searched for all of this information the same way that your average New Yorker would. We went on Google and we searched for food pantries in Crown Heights, and the information that we got was woefully inadequate. And so we wanted to improve that experience. And then also doing a callback to what Dr. Bowie had been talking about, there are probably some connections between the data quality of these food resources and the geographic location. There's probably some funky, weird stuff happening with that. So this being the state of New York City about a year ago, this is what had given rise to our project. And so what do we do? How do we curate our data? The first process was to do an initial one-shot scraping of existing data sets, and we had to do extensive data cleaning on this. Not many other organizations would have had the time or the manpower or the insight to be able to do that. After that, we have ongoing volunteer calls. We have a fleet of volunteers ranging anywhere from 20 to 80 of them from across the country. They manually go in and check all of our data points. We have phone numbers for every food pantry, every grocery store, and somebody calls up and says, hey, are you still operating? Are you still open on Mondays? Is the data that we have on you still correct? And our target is to update each record at least once a week so that when New Yorkers come to this database, they know that what they're getting is up to date. Of course, that manual verification of data is very time consuming, and because we're working with volunteers who don't necessarily have technical proficiencies, we had to create some automated solutions to managing this really wide data set. So we have automated aggregation and conflict resolution of trusted food pantry data partners. So we've partnered with a couple of the major players out there. We receive about 900 food pantry records from BetaNYC, about 600 from Department of Sanitation, 300 from City Harvest, 150 from another digital platform called Plentiful. And even among that, we have 182 records in our database that does not exist anywhere else except with us. And these numbers give you an idea of the scope of what we have, but not necessarily the complexity of the messiness of it. So a lot of times we'll have BetaNYC say one thing about a food pantry, it's open and it's open on Mondays, but we might get conflicting data from City Harvest that says, no, that record was, that food pantry closed 2 months ago. And it's incredibly complex for us and complicated for us to make sense of it. And this is effectively our job. So if you can imagine an average New Yorker having to navigate this sea on their own, how frustrating and how demoralizing that experience is. And so hopefully our project is a way to alleviate a lot of that frustration. When we were designing it from the get-go, we had this principle in mind from the very start. We wanted to design our architecture to protect the most vulnerable New Yorkers. So we made a conscious decision to separate our data layer, our master repository, from our presentation layer, and how we get that information out to people. It's structured in such a way that we can take the same data, print it onto a website, or send it to people via SMS or via smartphone app, or we can print it out on flyers and hand those out or send them in an email. In New York City, one of the major concerns, and I think the pandemic has really highlighted this, is there's a large technical divide, a large digital divide. Not everybody has high-speed internet. Not everybody has a laptop. Some New Yorkers access the internet primarily on their phone. And when thinking about the most vulnerable, we even partnered with the mayor's office to do a one-off printing of all of our food pantries on paper flyers, on like physical, actual media, so that we can hand out in homeless shelters. And these people don't have regular access. They don't have the technology to do it, but we made sure that they fit into our plan and that they were there from the get-go. Additionally to that,
and John, we're just coming up into time, so I'm wondering if you can find some of the best tidbits so we can get to hear what everyone else is working on. Thank you.
Sure, not a problem. So that's where we started, where we're at, and just an idea for where we're going to the future. We want to generalize this so that any other organization can take it up and run with it. We deployed a version of this statewide in Alabama in August 2020. And we're also, because we're sitting on a wealth of data, we're looking at it for potential analysis to push for public policy changes to improve New Yorkers' food security and diet related to health. That's sort of on our horizon. A little bit about myself. But I think what's more important is a link to the guides themselves. I'll paste this into chat as well so that you can see it. And if you know people who need to access it, you can share it with them. And then also my email address, if you ever want to talk or come into contact, this is how you can do it. And those are the juiciest bits.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for that. That's brilliant. Well, these were just 2 stories to get us started so we can start to think together.